now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to record my speech for the record first. We've talked about it many times. We express our disagreement in principle with the invitation of 8 delegations to today's meeting, in accordance with Rules 37 and 39. This figure clearly does not conform to the format of the discussion as stated. After all, the program includes briefings, debates, or public debates. We regret that the South Korean presidency has undermined the work of the Council. If 6 of them are members of the European Union and NATO at the same time, and they cannot say anything beyond the Yale and NATO common positions, what added value can these delegations bring to today's discussion? Apparently zero. The only purpose of their participation is to create a choir of votes to promote the same politicized policies in Brussels. This is a clear waste of the Council's valuable resources. We have talked many times about the counterproductive effect of this approach, which undermines the authority of B. We note that the permanent representative of the Czech Republic made a request today after 6 months of absence from the Security Council. We should remind you that last December, when he was about to discuss terrorist attacks, he refused to appear on the committee and sent pink shares to Belgorod, which had been supplied to the Czech Republic. We hope that today we will finally hear a comprehensive explanation from the permanent representative of the Czech Republic on their complicity in the crimes committed by the Kiev regime. Mr. Chairman, after today's meeting of the UN Security Council, Western colleagues formally expressed the need to discuss the political situation in Ukraine. Indeed, from the delegation's statement, we can't stand anything political. Or is there anything new for us to hear? However, we do have a political issue to discuss. For example, during Zelensky's presidency on May 20th, there were many legal nuances that emerged in this regard. Speculation about a possible successor is increasingly slipping away in the Western media. Who and which Ukrainian body should now be considered as legitimate representatives? From a legal point of view, who is legally entitled to participate in the peace talks in Ukraine? This is an important question, but no one talks about it. Has anyone here today raised the issue of the causes of the conflict? The continued large-scale intersection of the Russian-speaking population has created unabashed Russiophobia and is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations and the 1970 Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. It provides that the principle of respect for territorial integrity applies to states that act in accordance with the principle of equality and self-determination of peoples, and that therefore have a government representing all the peoples living in the territory. No one has spoken to the Security Council about the rights of Russian-speaking citizens, and without taking into account their views, according to the above-mentioned document, it is impossible to fully support the territorial integrity of the country. Regrettably, this paper has not been reflected and addressed to the Secretariat. Today we heard sympathy from the representative of the United Kingdom for peaceful Ukrainians, including children. All along since 2014, when the Kiev regime launched a war against its own citizens in Donbass, we didn't hear a word of sympathy for the children of Donbass. He killed mercilessly and stretched out the National Battalion. After all, we held Security Council meetings and our meetings, where we showed the injuries suffered by children in Donbass as a result of attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces, in addition to the children killed in Ukraine. It was your compassion. How can you and your Western partners not have him when you are deliberately attacking civilians in Russian cities by the Ukrainian armed forces? Your selective compassion is nothing but disgusting. As we have said many times, we are taking the floor to stop the massacre carried out by the Kiev regime against the people of Donbass. One more question, Mr. President. Members of the Security Council who advocated discussing human rights in the Security Council at any opportunity spoke of the fate of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. No, they didn't. However, today, in the complete silence of international organizations, Orthodox churches are being destroyed, and priests of the Orthodox Ukrainian Orthodox Church are being persecuted for political reasons. According to the statistics booked, the Ukrainian security services are proud. As of December 2023, more than 70 criminal cases have been filed against clergy and PC, 6 of which metropolitan. 19 of them were convicted. Just a month ago, a chapel on the site of Kiev's oldest 10th century church was demolished despite mass protests at the direction of the Kiev authorities and public protests. At present, the Kiev regime is only to serve the geopolitical interests of the West, because only this can guarantee its political survival. The socio-economic situation of the current Kiev authorities is not important now because they are temporary workers. However, it is also rapidly degrading. People are fleeing Ukraine in large numbers to escape the mobilization deployed by the Kiev regime, which the country has been nicknamed mobilization. They don't want to execute the line of directors doomed to the death of cannon fodder. According to official figures in Ukraine alone, about 6 million people have left. Just yesterday it was reported that the Kiev Symphony Orchestra had fled to Germany in its entirety. Similar cases are not uncommon among athletes. Corruption in humanitarian aid is rampant, and the media admires the most severe censorship. Food prices and housing utility rates have risen dozens of times. What makes ordinary people on the verge of survival? The Ukrainian population is growing and outrage is emerging. According to the International Institute of Sociology in Kiev, most Ukrainians believe that the authorities' actions are the cause of the deteriorating economic situation and the deteriorating democratic situation. At the same time, NATO members led by the United States, in the best non-colonial tradition, are actually plundering Ukraine at a meager price, buying its resource industrial and agricultural capabilities. Notorious Russiophobic Senator Lindsey Graham recently publicly stated that Kiev, quote, sits on $10.12 trillion worth of critical minerals. I don't want to give the money and assets to Putin for China to share. These mineral assets can be exploited by Ukraine and the West. End of quote. Notably, the West, worried about the return of funds invested in the conflict in Ukraine, is increasingly talking about the loans Ukrainians will have to repay. I wonder if Ukrainians themselves know this. Mr. President, today we have not heard all these inconvenient questions for Kiev. There is no word from the Western sponsors of the political situation. After all, they called this meeting for a family purpose, trying to revive the dead horse. Pseudo-peace, pseudo-global conference, Bergen what? For any sane observer, it was the beginning. Obviously, she is doomed to failure. Its organizers, the inspirers, thought of anything, but certainly not intentional. If the sole purpose of the meeting was to collect extras to nominate Russia, what kind of world could we talk about? The ultimatum is said to represent the international community. But the cunning teapot of those behind Bergenstock's summons is doomed to fail. First, most of the invitees discovered the primitive conspiracy and refused to participate. Second, many of the people present did not speak as planned by the organizers. They also bluntly said that there is no point in trying to discuss anything without Russia. Obviously, with this in mind, there may be a force, albeit for internal political reasons. The main inspirers, the United States, Germany, France, and Japan, left the conference before it was over. As a result, even Ukrainian representatives were forced to admit that the West's approach to the Ukraine crisis in the rest of the world was very different. The number of participants' geography clearly indicates that its exhaust is zero. No political weight, The results of all these meetings have not and cannot be a starting point for any serious discussion on the prospects for resolving the Ukraine crisis. Such a narrow party can be held at least a dozen times. However, they did not burn the world, nor would they bring it closer. Sorry about this meeting. The representative of the United Nations Secretariat was foolishly called an observer. This is unacceptable under Article 100 of the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, on June 14th, the President of the Russian Federation expressed a genuine peace proposal. Let me remind you that we are talking about Ukraine's non-aligned, neutral, nuclear-free status, its demilitarization, and the new territorial reality of the unified Nazi recognition of the status of Crimea, Sevastopol, Donetsk, and Luhansk People's Republics as subjects of the Russian Federation in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. In the future, all these basic principles should be fixed in the form of basic international agreements. Of course, this means lifting all Western sanctions against Russia. Moreover, in view of the systematic trampling of human rights and freedoms by the non-Nazi regime, which we have previously mentioned, we will oversee the prospects for conflict resolution in any dialogue. It is also important to bear in mind that Kiev must repeal its Russia-phobic legislation and other decisions, including a ban on the Russian language in all spheres of life, and permanently refuse to glorify Nazism. It is necessary to force Ukraine to return to the legal field in order to guarantee the rights and freedoms of all Ukrainian people, including the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. We have heard that Western countries and NATO leaders have hastily rejected this peace proposal. This is not a surprise to us. These rejections only confirm the strategic blindness of Western capitals. We saw something similar at the end of the 21st century when the United States, NATO, and Europe rejected the draft security agreement proposed by Russia. We urge our Western colleagues not to repeat their mistakes and listen to the voice of reason. Otherwise, the political and moral responsibility for the continued bloodshed will lie with them. It is clear that the reality on the ground along the line of combat contact will further change to the detriment of the Kiev regime. The conditions for starting negotiations will be different. Russia's proposal is aimed at freezing the conflict in order to truly end it. This will turn this tragic page in history. Gradually, step by step, we began to restore the relationship of trust and good neighborliness between Russia and Ukraine and even the whole of Europe. But this requires a fundamental change in the thinking carrier of Western political elites. They have fundamentally rejected attempts to use the Ukrainian project against Russia. NATO rejects its aggressive militaristic policy and resumes normal and comprehensive dialogue on all global security issues, taking into account the interests of all member states. This is the only way to avoid further escalation. We urge him to follow before it is too late. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement.